Half of Europe vanished in just a few years. This is the story of the Black Death, a pandemic that did far more than cause immense change. It shattered a 1,000-year-old system of power and gave birth to the modern world. By the end of this exploration, you will understand how a single event rewrote the rules of society and set the stage for the Renaissance. How did the common laborer suddenly gain influence over wealthy lords? What shift in thinking made people question everything they had been taught? The Plague Years ended an era and forged a new one, revealing a profound lesson about human resilience. What does it take for a society to be remade from its own foundations? Europe in the early 1300s was a world built on a simple, unbreakable chain of power. At the top were the lords who owned vast estates. Below them, knights pledged military service in exchange for land and prestige. And at the very bottom, the vast majority of people were serfs, bound by law and tradition to the land they worked. They grew the food that fed everyone, yet they owned nothing, could not leave without their lord's permission, and lived a life dictated by the harvest and the seasons. Their world was intensely local, rarely stretching beyond the nearest village church or the lord's manor house, which stood as the twin centers of their universe. The church provided spiritual guidance and a promise of a better life in the next world, while the manor demanded labor and loyalty in this one. This was the feudal system, a rigid hierarchy that had structured life for centuries. But this seemingly stable order was already under immense strain. The climate had turned against them, ushering in a period of colder, wetter weather that ruined harvests year after year. This led to the Great Famine, a time of widespread hardship where food became desperately scarce. The population, which had been growing steadily, now faced severe shortages, weakening entire communities. Society was like a piece of cloth stretched too thin, vulnerable to the slightest tear. All it would take was one more shock, one unprecedented event, to unravel the entire fabric. That shock was already moving silently across trade routes, heading directly for a continent completely unprepared for what was coming. The first ship arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina carrying a cargo far more valuable than any spice or silk, and a secret passenger that would change everything. Hidden within grain sacks and the ship's timbers were black rats, their fur carrying fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis bacterium. This was the Grim Reaper, arriving not with a scythe but on the trade winds that had once brought prosperity. From that single point of entry in 1347, the illness spread outward with incredible speed. It was not one challenge but three. The most common was the bubonic form, which caused painful swellings in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpits, and neck. Then there was the pneumonic plague, a sickness of the lungs that could pass from one person to another through the very air they breathed. The third and most severe was the septicemic plague, which invaded the bloodstream directly and was almost always a swift end. The sheer pace of the sickness left communities struggling to respond. A person could be healthy at dawn and gone before the next sunrise. In the face of such overwhelming events, the old certainties of medicine and prayer seemed to offer little protection. The chronicler Agnolo di Tura of Siena recorded the profound grief of that time, writing that he personally laid his 5 children to rest. He noted that so many were lost that all believed it was the end of the world. This was not a metaphor but a lived reality for millions. The illness showed no respect for social standing, touching the lives of nobles and serfs alike, though the crowded and less sanitary conditions of the poor often left them more exposed. The scale of loss was unprecedented, creating a demographic collapse that would echo for generations. This immediate human tragedy, this immense cost, was the first and most difficult step in dismantling the old world. It cleared the ground against all odds for something entirely new to eventually grow. The numbers defy comprehension. A landscape once teeming with life was now marked by silence and absence. Historians suggest the population of Europe fell from roughly 80 million people to perhaps 30 or 40 million within a few short years. That is a loss of 1 in every 2, sometimes even 2 in every 3 individuals. The social fabric was not just torn, it was profoundly changed. You could walk for miles and find only quiet villages, their fields growing wild and their church bells still. These were the silent villages, places where entire communities had been deeply affected or had moved in search of safety. In one region of England, records show that a manor which once collected rents from over 70 households could, just a few years later, account for only 27. The change was universal, touching every level of society. A king could face a personal transition in 1 week, and a farmer his entire family the next. Yet the hardship fell most heavily on the poor, whose crowded living conditions and limited resources left them most exposed. The immediate human experience was an ocean of personal reflection, but from this profound moment emerged a startling new reality. With so many hands gone, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Who would plant the crops? Who would tend the flocks? For the first time in centuries, the lords who owned the land faced a crisis they could not command away. A critical labor shortage was beginning to simmer, and it would soon boil over, challenging the unbreakable chain of feudal power at its very weakest link. The balance of power maintained for centuries began to tilt on its axis. Lords who had once commanded an endless supply of laborers now looked out over empty fields. Harvests that should have fed the kingdom were left untouched where they stood, a quiet symbol of a system coming undone. The economic engine of feudalism, built entirely on an abundance of human effort, had stalled. The land remained, but the hands to tend it were scarce. This was the fundamental weakness of the entire structure, a flaw now clear for all to see. For the serf, this new scarcity created an opportunity that was once unimaginable. A person legally bound to a lord's estate could now look a knight or a baron in the eye and make a request. Their labor was no longer a given. It had become a valued resource. If one lord would not offer better terms for plowing a field or bringing in the harvest, perhaps the lord in the next village would. This new mobility, born of necessity and newfound influence, began to soften the bonds of feudal obligation. We can trace this shift in the careful script of manorial court rolls, where once a lord recorded the names of many laborers owing days of work. Now the lists grew shorter. The entries tell a fresh story, one of discussions and changing costs. Payment for a day's reaping or threshing, once fixed by tradition and law, began to rise steadily. This was a quiet challenge to the old ways, a subtle economic transformation happening field by field, village by village. The system's rules were being reshaped out of sheer need. This inflexibility was the established order's greatest vulnerability. It was a rigid structure that could not adapt, and so it began to strain under the weight of a simple, unchangeable economic truth. When the number of available workers fell sharply, the worth of their work increased greatly. How would the nobility, the traditional holders of authority, respond to this sudden shift in their influence? And how would everyday people use their delicate, newfound position to shape their own futures? The effort to answer these questions would reshape an entire continent. The lords of the manor could read the numbers on their own account books. The figures were stark and undeniable. Their response to this crisis was not one of adaptation, but of rigid control. In England, this culminated in the Statute of Laborers of 1351. This was a law born of deep concern, an attempt to use the full force of government to turn back time itself. It commanded that wages be fixed at their old, pre-plague levels and made it a punishable act for any worker to refuse a job or ask for more pay. An employer who offered a higher wage to attract a scarce worker could also face penalties. The intent was clear: to force the economic genie back into its bottle and reassert the old feudal chain of command through royal decree. Yet a law written on parchment in a distant capital could not easily dictate the price of labor in a remote village. The simple, powerful force of supply and demand proved far stronger than any legislation. A field still needed to be plowed, a harvest still needed to be gathered. If one lord stubbornly enforced the old rates, a worker could simply walk to the next estate, where a more practical lord might quietly offer a better deal, turning a blind eye to the statute. The old bonds of serfdom, which had once tied a person to a specific plot of land, were fraying with every step a laborer took in search of a fairer wage. This movement of people created a quiet but massive shift in power. The growing towns and cities became magnets for those leaving the manors. These urban centers, with their guilds and markets, offered a different kind of life, one based on trade and skill rather than feudal obligation. Here, a person's worth was not predetermined by birth, but could be shaped by their own hands and wits. The failure of the Statute of Laborers was a clear signal that authority could no longer be maintained by command alone. The nobility had tried to solve an economic problem with a legal club, and the club had shattered in their hands. This left a simmering tension across the countryside. If the law would not acknowledge the new value of common labor, how long would the laborers themselves remain peaceful? The foundations of society were not just shifting, they were beginning to tremble. That quiet walk to the next village was more than a search for a better wage. It was a declaration of independence. For the first time in living memory, the common laborer held a form of power in their calloused hands. The old system of serfdom, which had defined life for generations, was built on a simple premise that labor was abundant and land was the scarce, valuable resource. The great changes of the time had turned that logic completely upside down. Now land was plentiful, but the human effort needed to make it productive was the true prize. A farmer who once owed his lord 3 days of labor each week could now approach that same lord and ask to pay a cash rent instead, freeing him to use his extra time to earn money working for others. This shift from bonded labor to paid tenancy was a revolution in slow motion. It meant that a person's work was becoming a commodity to be sold, not an obligation to be fulfilled. As the historian Barbara Tuchman observed, the individual worth of the common man had risen. This was not just an economic adjustment, it was a seismic change in the social order. The feudal aristocracy watched this transformation with growing concern. Their entire way of life, their wealth and their control had been built upon the fixed, cheap labor of the serf. Now that foundation was shifting. A lord's income was shrinking as he was forced to pay higher wages, while his ability to command obedience was fading as workers gained the freedom to simply leave. The simmering tension between a class trying to reclaim its old authority and a class enjoying its new autonomy could not be contained forever. This newfound power was not just being felt in the quiet negotiations over a field's rent. It was beginning to echo in the crowded streets of growing towns, where the air was starting to smell not of soil, but of opportunity and change. The crowded, narrow streets that had been pathways of fear now pulsed with a different kind of energy. While urban centers were deeply affected during the early period, their very nature as hubs of trade and people made them the first to feel the tremors of a new economy. For the rural laborer who had walked away from the manor, the city gates represented more than just a new home. They were a portal to a different kind of life. Here, a person was not tied to the land, but a potential apprentice, a journeyman, or a merchant. The air was thick with the smells of baking bread, forging metal, and drying leather, a world away from the scent of soil and harvest. This magnetic pull transformed towns into centers of social change, drawing in thousands seeking to trade old obligations for new economic opportunity. At the heart of this urban transformation were the guilds, the powerful associations of skilled craftsmen. Before the great changes, these organizations carefully managed who could practice a trade, setting long apprenticeships and limiting membership to preserve their crafts. But the same demographic shift that empowered field laborers also reshaped their world. A master mason or a skilled weaver was now a rare and valued asset. With fewer masters and fewer still to train new apprentices, the guilds found their members could command prices for their work that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. This surge in earning power did not just enrich individual craftsmen, it fundamentally strengthened the entire urban middle class. Wealth began to concentrate in the hands of those who worked with their skills, not just those who owned land by birthright. This new fluidity reshaped entire cities. In Florence, the wealth generated by banking and the wool trade funded breathtaking new architecture that proclaimed the confidence of its citizens. In Venice, the power of its merchant fleets built a maritime empire guided more by commerce than by any traditional authority. And in London, a bustling port city, a merchant's ledger could carry as much influence as a noble's title. For the first time, the path to influence was not solely through inheritance, but through acumen, trade, and talent. A dynamic new center of power was emerging within the city walls, one that openly competed with the traditional authority of the rural manor. This competition fostered an environment ripe for new ideas. The concentration of wealth, talent, and diverse perspectives in these growing urban centers created a unique cultural climate. Patrons emerged who were willing to fund artists, architects, and thinkers, not solely for religious devotion but for civic pride and personal legacy. The focus of society was subtly shifting from the next world to the possibilities of this one. This urban energy, born from necessity and forged in economic change, was quietly laying the intellectual and financial groundwork for a coming explosion of creativity. But such a profound redistribution of power and wealth could not occur without resistance from the old order. The established aristocracy would not surrender its privileges quietly, and the encounter between these two emerging worlds was about to become more visible. The very institution that promised divine protection was now facing a profound challenge of its own creation. For centuries, the Church had been the unshakable pillar of society, interpreting divine will and offering comfort from the struggles of daily life. Its rituals, from daily prayers to grand processions, were seen as powerful connections to the sacred. But when the illness arrived, these spiritual protections seemed to falter. Prayers appeared to go unheard. Holy objects, long believed to carry special meaning, offered no visible defense. The gatherings of devoted followers in the streets often drew large crowds where sickness could move more freely. This was not just a failure of earthly methods, it was a deep erosion of spiritual trust. If the Church could not provide relief in such difficult times, then what was the true nature of its guidance? This question began to settle in the minds of those who remained, creating a widespread crisis of belief. Out of this spiritual uncertainty emerged one of the most striking movements of the era, the Flagellants. Believing the widespread hardship was a form of divine correction for society's wayward path, these individuals traveled in large, solemn groups. Their approach was not to seek mediation through priests, but to practice their own intense form of repentance. In public spaces across Europe, they would form circles, removing their upper garments and using knotted cords in ritual acts while chanting hymns and pleading for heavenly compassion. Their visceral, public demonstrations of faith both captivated and alarmed those who watched. More significantly, it presented a direct question to the Church's established order. Here was an expression of belief that functioned completely outside the oversight of religious authorities, implying that everyday people might find their own way toward grace without the traditional structures as go-betweens. The movement was a sign of an institution loosening its hold on the spirit of the community. This shift was deepened by a stark reality. The clergy themselves had been deeply affected. Priests and monks, following their calling to offer final blessings and console the suffering, had been lost in overwhelming numbers. In some areas, close to half of all religious figures were gone. This led to a critical shortage of formally trained, ordained leaders. Their replacements were frequently men with little education, sometimes possessing only basic reading skills, who could provide little beyond memorized ceremonies without deeper insight. The quality of spiritual teaching and personal care fell greatly, and in that space, older local customs and folk wisdom thrived once again. People looked for understanding wherever it could be discovered, from community healers to those who read the stars, further diminishing the Church's exclusive role as the source of truth. This deep sense of disillusionment, the growth of self-directed movements, and the thinning of educated religious voices all joined to create an opening in the foundation of medieval life. For the first time in centuries, individuals were compelled to wonder not only about the capability of their leaders, but about the core of their connection to the sacred. If the traditional spiritual framework no longer felt solid, then where else might one search for meaning? This new space in the European consciousness, born from hardship and a re-examination of faith, would in time allow fresh perspectives to emerge, from the questioning spirit of the Reformation to the early curiosity of a scientific outlook. The world was being cleared not only of people but of long-held assumptions, creating an opportunity for entirely new ideas to take shape. The quiet fields were now a marketplace of new ideas. A lord who once expected labor from those who worked his lands now found it more practical to ask for coin. This simple change from service to cash rent began to unravel the manorial economy at its core. The entire system had been built on self-sufficiency, where each estate produced nearly everything it needed, from food to tools to clothes. But with a much smaller population, that old model no longer functioned. Land was plentiful, but labor was expensive, so lords facing empty treasuries made a series of practical decisions. They began to lease out their vast demesne lands to enterprising farmers who could pay a steady rent. They changed the old labor obligations, allowing former workers to become cash-paying tenants. This monetization of the countryside was a revolution in daily life. Suddenly, a farmer's success was not measured by how well he served his lord, but by how wisely he could manage his rented plot and sell his surplus in a local market. This new flow of money encouraged a different kind of thinking, one focused on specialization and trade. Why struggle to grow grapes in England when you could raise sheep and sell the wool to Flemish weavers, then use the profits to buy excellent wine from Bordeaux? Regions began to focus on what they did best. The rich pastures of England became dedicated to wool production. The sunny slopes of France and Italy perfected their vineyards. The Low Countries honed their skills in textile manufacturing. This was the birth of a new economic logic, one of comparative advantage. It meant that a village's prosperity was now tied to distant markets and trade routes, not just to the local harvest. The economy was becoming interconnected, a web of commercial relationships that stretched across the continent. All this new activity required new tools to manage it. The increased circulation of money and the need for investment created a demand for financial services that simply did not exist before. A merchant in Genoa needed a safe way to send payment to a partner in Bruges. A farmer wanting to lease more land needed a loan to buy seed and livestock. From this necessity, the early foundations of modern banking emerged. Italian families like the Medicis and the Bardi began building vast financial networks, developing letters of credit, bills of exchange, and commercial partnerships that allowed capital to flow across borders. They were not just money lenders, they were the architects of a new economic system, one where wealth could be mobile and productive, invested in everything from improved plows to trading voyages. These changes, taken together, were laying the foundational stones for a new economic era. The economic landscape was no longer dictated by old obligations and tradition, but by the impersonal forces of supply and demand. Production and distribution began to follow the signals of the market. This was a fundamental alteration of the European world, a shift from a society organized around status and service to one increasingly organized around commerce and contract. But such a deep transformation of daily life and economic power could not occur without a corresponding shift in the human spirit. If a person's value was now something to be negotiated in the marketplace, what did that say about their place in the universe? A new way of thinking about the individual was beginning to stir, one that would soon find its voice in art, literature, and a renewed fascination with the world itself. This profound awareness of life's finite nature began to color the very art on the church walls. Where once paintings depicted serene saints and a distant heaven, a new and thought-provoking motif emerged, the danse macabre. In these vivid frescoes and woodcuts, symbolic figures, elegant and reflective, guide people from every walk of life in a final, universal dance. A proud king, a wealthy merchant, a humble farmer, all are taken by the hand, their earthly titles and treasures rendered utterly meaningless. This was not a celebration of fear, but a powerful cultural meditation on the shared nature of our human journey. It asked a simple, piercing question. If this transition comes for everyone alike, what true value lies in the social distinctions we build our lives upon? This memento mori, this reminder of life's preciousness, encouraged a deep personal introspection. The question of spiritual meaning was no longer something to be managed solely by the distant rituals of the church, but became an intimate, urgent matter for the individual soul to confront. People began to seek a more direct personal connection with the sacred, a relationship built on internal faith rather than external ceremony. This spiritual shift found its voice in the pages of personal books of hours and other devotional texts, which were increasingly written not in scholarly Latin, but in the vernacular, the everyday language of the people. Now, a merchant or a craftsman's wife could read spiritual passages and offer personal prayers in their own tongue, engaging with their faith without a priest as an essential translator. This was a quiet revolution in access, moving religious experience from the public space of the cathedral to the private space of the heart. The very act of reading and reflecting alone fostered a new sense of the inner self. This growing focus on individual experience and personal worth was a radical break from the collective identity that had defined feudal life for centuries. A person was no longer just a serf bound to a lord or a soul merely part of a congregation, but an individual with a unique path to understanding and a personal destiny. This new way of seeing the self, born from profound reflection and a re-examination of what truly matters, would become the fertile ground for the seeds of humanism. It was a clear demonstration that from the deepest hardship can emerge not only new economies, but entirely new ways of thinking about what it means to be human. The art that emerged from this era reflects the deep inner world of a generation. The serene, golden backgrounds of earlier Gothic art, which portrayed a perfect and distant heaven, could no longer contain the raw human emotion of the time. In their place came a new and startling realism, one that did not look away from life's challenges. The famous fresco known as the Triumph of Death in Pisa presents a powerful vision. It shows a symbolic figure on a pale horse, leading a procession that sweeps up everyone from cardinals and kings to common laborers, reminding all viewers of a shared human journey. In the detailed pages of illuminated manuscripts, artists began to depict scenes of personal reflection and the passage of time with an unflinching eye. These were not images meant only for quiet contemplation. They were powerful cultural statements, a silent reflection on a social and spiritual order that had seemed to offer little comfort when it was needed most. They asked a difficult question of those who viewed them. If everyone, high and low, faced the same ultimate journey, then what was the true foundation of earthly power and privilege? This artistic shift was a profound testament to a collective experience, a way for society to process its questions and its hopes through the power of image and symbol. Simultaneously, the very hands that funded this new art were changing. For centuries, the primary patrons of art had been the church and the high nobility, commissioning works to honor divine figures and reinforce their own authority. Now, a new class of patrons stepped into the light, their pockets filled with wealth from trade, banking, and skilled craftsmanship. The powerful guilds, representing everyone from wool merchants to goldsmiths, began to commission altar pieces for their own chapels and statues for their guild halls. Wealthy merchant families like the Medici in Florence used art as a form of civic pride and personal legacy. This was a revolutionary change in the cultural landscape. Art was no longer solely in the service of god or feudal lord. It was now also commissioned to celebrate the achievements of ordinary citizens and the bustling life of the city. This new source of funding naturally led to new subjects. Artists began to receive commissions for realistic portraits, not of saints, but of merchants and their wives, capturing the distinct character and quiet dignity of an individual face. They painted detailed landscapes that celebrated the familiar beauty of the local countryside, rather than an idealized heavenly garden. Scenes from daily life, from festive weddings to the quiet industry of a workshop, began to appear in paintings, affirming the value and interest of the human experience right here on Earth. This diversification of theme broke the old monopolies that the church and nobility had held over cultural expression. The world of art was suddenly richer, more complex, and far more human. This was the quiet, visual dawn of a new era, where the focus was shifting from the afterlife to the present moment, and from divine authority to the potential of the individual. The canvas was being prepared for the full blossoming of the Renaissance. The ink on a Manumission charter was more than just words. It was a key unlocking a 1,000-year-old cage. Across Western Europe, lords who once expected endless labor from those tied to the land began to offer a new kind of arrangement, legal freedom in exchange for a fixed, predictable cash payment. This process, known as formal manumission, was a quiet revolution in the relationship between power and person. An individual could now pay their lord a sum of money to be released from all future labor obligations, transforming a bond of service into a straightforward business agreement. For the lord, it was a way to secure immediate income in a time of shrinking revenues. For the person, it was the purchase of their own future, a chance to become a free tenant farmer, a wage laborer, or to seek their fortune in the bustling towns. This was not a sudden wave, but a slow, relentless process that gradually dissolved the very foundations of the old system. The institution did not collapse in a single day, but it lost its moral and economic justification field by field, payment by payment. The rigid feudal chain which had linked a person's destiny to their birth was being reforged into a chain of cash. In England, this transformation was echoed within the halls of justice. The royal courts, once the stronghold of aristocratic privilege, slowly began to adapt to the new economic reality. Judges increasingly recognized the rights of tenants who held land by a cash rent, protecting them from arbitrary eviction. Cases involving laborers and their wages began to be heard not solely on the basis of the old Statute of Laborers, but with a growing appreciation for the principle of a mutual agreement. The concept of a contract, a voluntary pact between two parties, began to challenge the rigid duties imposed by feudal tenure. A lord's word was no longer the final law. The terms of a written or spoken agreement carried weight. This legal evolution was slow, uneven, and often resisted, but its direction was unmistakable. It represented a monumental shift in the very structure of society, moving from an order based on status and birth to one increasingly organized around agreement and commerce. Your worth was becoming less about who your ancestors were and more about what you could agree to and accomplish. These legal changes provided a stable framework for the new economic realities, protecting the hard-won gains of ordinary people. A farmer who had negotiated a fair rent or a laborer who had secured a higher wage now had, in theory, a legal avenue to defend that achievement. This process did not erase the vast inequalities of the age, but it did begin to place limits on the arbitrary power of the aristocracy. The law was slowly, grudgingly, beginning to catch up with life, creating a new set of rules for a world that had already been profoundly changed. This legal scaffolding would prove essential, for the new economic and social tensions were about to express themselves in a far more visible and dramatic confrontation. The simmering tension finally boiled over with the strike of a new tax. In 1381, the English crown, desperate to fund its ongoing conflict with France, imposed a third poll tax. This was a flat charge on every adult, a burden that fell most heavily on those with the least to give. For a peasant farmer already enjoying the benefits of higher wages, this tax was more than an economic hardship. It was the final insult, a blatant attempt to claw back the newfound power of common laborers through royal decree. The response was not a collection of isolated protests, but a coordinated uprising that swept across the countryside. Thousands of men and women, armed with farm tools and a burning sense of injustice, began to march on London. They were not a mindless mob, but a movement with clear leaders and even clearer demands. At their head was a man named Wat Tyler, a figure who seemed to embody the very spirit of this new assertiveness. Their objectives were revolutionary. They called for the complete abolition of serfdom, for the right to rent land at a fair price of 4 pence per acre, and for a full pardon for their actions. This was a direct challenge to the entire feudal structure, articulated not as a plea, but as a set of non-negotiable terms from the governed to their governors. The rebels demonstrated a stunning level of organization, cutting communications and managing their ranks as they converged on the capital. When they entered London, the very heart of royal power, they did not simply riot. They targeted symbols of the authority they questioned. They stormed the mighty Tower of London, a fortress that represented the unassailable power of the crown. There they located and confronted the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, who was also the Lord Chancellor and a chief architect of the hated poll tax. What followed was a deliberate political act, a shocking demonstration that the traditional shields of title and office would no longer protect those who governed unjustly. The message was unmistakable. The old rules were void. The young King Richard II, only 14 years old, was forced to meet the rebels at Smithfield. In a dramatic confrontation, Wat Tyler presented their radical demands directly to the monarch, even addressing him with a startling familiarity. The situation was explosive, a king facing his armed subjects in a negotiation over the future of the kingdom. In the chaos that followed, Tyler was gravely wounded by the king's party, an act that could have sparked a terrible conflict. Yet, in a moment of remarkable presence of mind, King Richard rode forward and addressed the rebel host, declaring, "I will be your leader." This single gesture, a promise of clemency and reform, was enough to persuade the crowds to disperse. They believed they had won, but the promise was an illusion. As soon as the rebels returned home, the king revoked all his charters of freedom. A swift and firm response followed, with many of the revolt's leaders sought out. The immediate victory had been snatched away, yet to see the revolt as a simple failure is to miss its profound and lasting impact. The ruling class had received the shock of its life. They had seen their capital occupied, their highest officials confronted, and the very legitimacy of their rule called into question by the very people whose labor they depended upon. The memory of Smithfield would remain with the nobility for generations. While they ended the revolt, they could not unsee the collective power of the common people. The event proved beyond any doubt that the feudal compact was broken beyond repair. Authorities now had to govern with a reluctant but permanent awareness of popular will, understanding that the stability of the realm depended not just on commanding obedience, but on managing the expectations of a newly assertive populace. The quiet economic shifts in the countryside had found their loud, undeniable political voice. That drive for efficiency reshaped the very tools that worked the land. With labor now a costly and scarce resource, landlords who once relied on sheer numbers of workers began to see the economic wisdom in investing in machines. The heavy, wheeled plow, which could turn the dense, clay-rich soils of northern Europe far more effectively than older models, became a sound financial decision. A single team using such a plow could prepare a field in the time it might have taken 3 teams with lighter ards. Similarly, the power of rivers was harnessed with renewed vigor. Lords financed the construction of new water mills and windmills, which could grind grain or full cloth with relentless, automated force, tasks that would have previously required endless hours of human effort. This shift was not born from a sudden love of engineering, but from a practical calculation. A mill was a one-time investment that never asked for wages, never fell ill, and never left for a better offer in the next village. The logic of capital was beginning to replace the logic of feudal obligation. This new thinking extended to the use of the land itself. Why pour immense effort into labor-intensive cereal farming when a more profitable alternative presented itself? The booming textile industries of Flanders and Italy created an insatiable demand for high-quality wool. In response, many English lords made a momentous decision. They began to enclose their open fields, converting vast tracts of arable land into pastures for sheep. This process, known as enclosure, brought significant change for rural communities, but it was immensely profitable for the landowners. A few shepherds could now manage flocks that roamed over lands which had once required the constant toil of dozens of families. The countryside itself was being remade, not for subsistence but for the market. Alongside this pastoral revolution, a more subtle but equally vital innovation was taking root: the 3-field system of crop rotation, a practice that had been slowly developing before the great changes, now spread rapidly out of sheer necessity. Instead of leaving half their land fallow each year in the old 2-field system, farmers divided their holdings into 3. One section was planted with a winter crop like wheat or rye, another with a spring crop like oats, barley, or legumes such as peas and beans, and the third was left to rest. This simple reorganization brought profound benefits. It increased the total amount of land under cultivation each year from 1/2 to 2/3. More importantly, the spring planting of legumes actually replenished the soil with essential nitrogen, naturally restoring its fertility for the following year. This smarter use of the earth led to more reliable and bountiful harvests, which were crucial for feeding a reduced but increasingly urban population. The yield per worker soared. A smaller number of people, armed with better tools and smarter methods, could now produce a surplus large enough to support not only themselves but also the growing towns. This agricultural surplus was the fundamental fuel for everything that followed. It meant that not everyone had to farm to eat, freeing up hands and minds for other trades, for crafts, and for new ideas. The relentless pressure to do more with less, born from profound demographic change, had ignited a cycle of innovation that would eventually power the rise of an entirely new economic era. The ledgers of commerce began to outweigh the deeds to land. In the decades following the great changes, the very nature of wealth was being redefined, shifting from the static ownership of estates to the fluid, dynamic power of moving money. The old feudal manors, once self-contained islands of economic activity, were now being drawn into a vast and growing web of trade. This was the acceleration of a commercial revolution, a period of intense economic integration that fundamentally rewired the continent. At the heart of this transformation were the Italian city-states, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Florence. These hubs of maritime trade and banking had long cultivated sophisticated financial practices, but now their methods became essential tools for a recovering Europe. They perfected the bill of exchange, a financial instrument that allowed a merchant in Bruges to pay a supplier in Milan without the immense risk and difficulty of transporting chests of coin across hundreds of miles. This was more than a convenience. It was the lifeblood of long-distance trade, creating a system of international credit that made commerce faster, safer, and far more expansive. Alongside this, the method of double-entry bookkeeping emerged, providing merchants with a clear, accurate picture of their financial health. By recording every transaction in two separate accounts, one for debits and one for credits, a businessman could see at a glance whether he was truly profitable. This clarity and accountability allowed for better planning, smarter investments, and the growth of much larger, more complex business ventures. The Italian bankers became the indispensable engineers of this new economy, their networks of agents and partners forming the first truly European financial system. New trade routes stretched across the continent and beyond, while old ones hummed with renewed activity. The demand for luxury goods surged not from a larger population, but from a wealthier one. Those who had come through the earlier period, from successful farmers to skilled artisans, now had more disposable income. They desired finer things: Flemish wool, Italian silk, spices from the East, and glass from Venice. This demand fueled a cycle of economic growth that reached from the ports of the Mediterranean to the markets of the North Sea. The Hanseatic League, a powerful alliance of German trading cities, extended its reach, dominating commerce in the Baltic and North Seas with its fleets of cog ships. Their trading posts from London to Novgorod became nodes in a continent-wide network, exchanging timber and furs from the north for wine and cloth from the south. This constant flow of goods began to knit Europe together, reducing the isolation that had once defined the feudal manor. A lord in England might now drink wine from Gascony, sweetened with sugar from Cyprus, and served on a plate manufactured in Italy. His world was no longer just his local estate, it was connected to a globalizing marketplace. The true architects of this new world were the great merchant families, and none were more emblematic than the Medici of Florence. Starting as humble wool traders, they leveraged their financial acumen to build a banking empire that stretched from London to Constantinople. Their wealth was not held in silent, dormant fields, but in active, productive capital, loaned to popes and kings, invested in trading voyages, and used to finance the burgeoning cloth industry. The Medici did not simply rival the old aristocracy in wealth. They created a new kind of elite, one whose influence was based on financial networks and commercial intelligence rather than ancient titles and landed estates. A king might command armies, but a Medici could command the flow of credit that funded those armies. This was a profound shift in the seat of power. The rise of this mercantile class created a new social dynamic, where a person's standing could be earned through shrewdness and enterprise, not merely inherited through bloodlines. The continent was being bound together not by feudal oaths, but by contracts, credit, and the relentless, unifying pulse of trade. The crown found its moment in the nobility's distress. For generations, a king's power was often more symbolic than absolute, checked by a patchwork of powerful dukes and barons who commanded their own knights and treasuries from their ancestral lands. But the same economic forces that enriched the common laborer now squeezed the feudal aristocracy. With fields lying fallow and labor costs soaring, the rental income that was the lifeblood of their status was steadily drying up. A duke might still own a vast estate, but his ability to fund a private army or defy the throne was withering away with each passing season of financial strain. Ambitious monarchs, from the Plantagenets in England to the Valois in France, recognized this vulnerability as a historic opportunity. They moved decisively to consolidate authority that had been fragmented for centuries, building the framework of the modern state upon the shifting foundations of feudal privilege. These kings bypassed the old system entirely. Instead of calling upon their nobles to provide knights for 40 days of service, a limited and often unreliable feudal levy, they began to raise standing armies funded by royal taxation. This was a revolutionary change. Soldiers now swore loyalty and received their pay directly from the crown, their allegiance shifting from a local magnate to the national sovereign. To manage this new flow of money and administer the realm, kings established royal bureaucracies. They staffed these growing administrations not with hereditary lords, but with educated men from the rising middle class, lawyers, merchants, and clerks whose loyalty was to the institution of the monarchy that had granted them their influence. A talented commoner could now wield more real power than a duke. His authority derived from competence and royal favor, not from the land his family had held for generations. This centralization of power created a new political reality, one that required the consent of the governed, or at least their representatives. A king could not simply impose heavy taxes without provoking widespread unrest, as the Peasants Revolt had starkly demonstrated. The solution was to formalize negotiation. In England, the Parliament, with its House of Commons representing the wealthy towns and counties, gained new prominence. The king needed to secure its approval for taxation, giving the merchant and landowning classes a direct voice in royal finance. In France, the Estates General served a similar purpose, assembling to grant the crown the funds it needed. This was not democracy as we know it, but it was a profound step away from autocratic rule. It integrated the economic power of the middle class directly into the machinery of government, acknowledging that the state's strength now depended on commerce and consent as much as on feudal obligation. The political map of Europe was being redrawn not by conquest, but by this quiet administrative revolution. The old, fragmented mosaic of feudal fiefdoms was gradually coalescing into more unified, centralized kingdoms with stronger national identities. The authority that had once been dispersed among 1,000 castle walls was now concentrating in royal courts and capital cities. This crucial transition from a world defined by local loyalties to one organized around broader national institutions was dramatically accelerated by the great changes. The leveling of the old social order had cleared the way for a new kind of power to rise, one that would shape the destiny of the continent for centuries to come. And as this new state solidified its control over land and law, a parallel revolution was stirring in the human mind, a reawakening of classical learning and artistic expression that would forever change how people saw themselves and their place in the world. The population did not simply rebound. For nearly 200 years, the number of people in Europe remained far lower than it had been before the great changes, but this prolonged demographic pause created a social landscape that was entirely new. Families became smaller and more deliberate. Men and women began to marry later in life, a practical decision that reflected the newfound economic value of an individual's labor and the desire to secure a better future before starting a family. This shift in personal choices rippled outward, reshaping the entire structure of society. With fewer people competing for resources, the pressure that had defined the earlier world simply faded away. Land, once the scarce and jealously guarded prize of the nobility, was now relatively abundant. For the first time in centuries, an ordinary farmer could realistically hope to rent or even own a substantial plot of land, freeing him from the shadow of the manor. This access to resources translated directly into a better daily life. The average person's diet improved, shifting from a monotonous reliance on bread and pottage to include more meat, dairy, and fish. People were not just surviving, they were living with a degree of comfort and security that their grandparents could never have envisioned. This higher standard of living created something previously unheard of for the common classes: disposable income. A carpenter could now afford a new tool, a brewer's wife might buy a length of fine cloth, and a farmer could purchase a metal plowshare. This circulation of money through the hands of everyday people further stimulated the economy, creating a virtuous cycle of production and consumption. The old feudal hierarchy, with its fixed roles and limited opportunities, had been built upon a foundation of scarcity and surplus labor. That foundation was now gone, replaced by a demographic breathing space that rewarded initiative and skill. A young man was no longer destined to inherit his father's cramped strip of land. He could apprentice himself to a craftsman in a nearby town. A woman's labor in the household or in a trade like weaving was now recognized with higher wages, granting her a new measure of economic independence. This slower population growth did not mean stagnation, it meant stability. It provided the crucial space for the new economic and social structures to solidify. The social fabric that emerged from this long recovery was not a replica of the old one, patched and mended. It was a new tapestry, woven with threads of greater personal freedom, economic mobility, and a widespread appreciation for the worth of an individual's work. This more resilient and dynamic society, born from a period of profound transition, had finally built a stable and prosperous foundation. The ground was now truly prepared for the seeds of a cultural revolution to burst into full flower. The old certainties were gone, and in their place came a restless curiosity. This intellectual vacuum, created by the profound questioning of both church and feudal authority, became fertile ground for a new way of thinking. People who had seen the established order falter were now more willing to look elsewhere for answers, and their gaze fell upon the wisdom of the ancient world. This was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual turning of the cultural soil, preparing for the seeds of the Renaissance and its guiding philosophy, humanism. At the heart of this shift was Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch, a scholar who lived through the very heart of that complex period. His personal experience of that era's challenges led him to champion a radical idea that the key to a meaningful life could be found not only in preparation for the next world, but in the study of classical texts and the cultivation of human virtue in this one. He scoured monastery libraries for forgotten manuscripts of Cicero and Virgil, arguing that these works held timeless lessons about ethics, citizenship, and the potential of the individual. Petrarch's humanism placed a new emphasis on personal achievement, eloquent speech, and active participation in civic life. It was a philosophy that celebrated what people could accomplish with their own minds and talents, a clear departure from earlier views that focused on human limitations and spiritual reflection. The question was no longer just how to save one's soul, but how to live a full and virtuous life. This new learning needed institutions to nurture it, and the universities of Europe, though also shaped by earlier transitions, began to transform. Once dominated by theology, their curricula now expanded to include Roman law, classical literature, medicine, and the natural sciences. A student could now aspire to be more than a priest or a monk. He could become a lawyer, a physician, a diplomat, or a civil servant. This created a new class of educated professionals, men whose authority came from their knowledge and skills, not from their birthright. They filled the growing bureaucracies of kings and city-states, applying reason and legal principles to the problems of governance. The bustling intellectual life of these universities fostered a spirit of debate and inquiry that had been largely absent before. In the lecture halls of Bologna, Padua, and Paris, scholars began to subject ancient texts and even traditional doctrines to rigorous logical analysis. This method, known as scholasticism, honed the tools of reason and argument, creating a cultural environment where ideas could be challenged and tested. This was the crucial intellectual training ground, the mental framework that would later allow figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo to observe the natural world with fresh eyes. The social and economic transformations of the previous decades had cleared the space for this awakening, but it was this new hunger for classical knowledge and reasoned inquiry that gave it direction and purpose. The world was being re-examined, and in the rediscovered works of antiquity, Europeans found a mirror reflecting their own burgeoning sense of possibility. The search for a cure forced a difficult but necessary reckoning with old ideas. The established medical wisdom of Galen, which explained illness as an imbalance of the body's four humors, seemed completely powerless against a sickness that moved with such speed and intensity. The failure of traditional practices, from bloodletting to complex herbal mixtures, created a deep crisis of authority in the healing arts. When learned physicians in their long robes could offer no more protection than a village elder, people felt compelled to look elsewhere for answers. This breakdown of trust, while deeply unsettling, cleared the way for a more practical and observational approach. Doctors slowly began to prioritize what they could see and record in their patients, moving away from purely theoretical explanations. They started to keep more detailed notes on the progression of symptoms, the patterns of spread, and what methods, if any, seemed to offer even minor relief. This was the hesitant, early birth of an empirical mindset, a shift from asking what ancient texts said to asking what the evidence before them showed. This new way of thinking extended from the doctor's chamber to the city square. If the cause of the illness was not fully understood, its patterns of movement could at least be observed and perhaps interrupted. The bustling maritime Republic of Venice, a hub of global trade that was uniquely vulnerable to imported sickness, took a monumental step. In 1403, it established the first permanent quarantine station on a small island in its lagoon. The term itself comes from the Italian word for 40, quaranta, referring to the 40 days a ship's crew and passengers were required to isolate before entering the city. This was not based on a precise understanding of germs, but on a practical observation that a waiting period seemed to reduce the arrival of new cases. It represented a profound shift in responsibility. For the first time, the state was asserting a direct, secular role in protecting the collective health of its citizens, an idea that the old feudal lords had never contemplated. Other cities followed Venice's lead, implementing early sanitation laws, hiring officials to oversee street cleaning, and attempting to manage waste disposal. These were the clumsy first steps of public health, born from sheer necessity. The dissemination of medical knowledge also began to change. Latin, the language of scholars and clerics, was no longer the sole gatekeeper of information. Medical texts were increasingly translated into the vernacular, the everyday language of the people. Now, an educated merchant or a town official could read about preventative measures or descriptions of illnesses, making knowledge that had once been locked away in university libraries more widely available. While the true mechanism of how sickness spread would remain a mystery for centuries, this period saw the beginnings of a more systematic approach to tracking disease. City councils began to keep records of mortality, creating simple but vital early maps of an outbreak's progress. This information, however basic, allowed for more informed decisions about where to allocate resources or when to enforce isolation. The collective experience of the earlier years had instilled a powerful, lasting lesson that the health of the individual was inextricably linked to the health of the community. This slow awakening to a societal duty of care, this shift from prayer to policy and from theory to observation, laid the foundational stones for the entire structure of modern medicine and public health. How would this new emphasis on human agency and earthly observation, once applied to the body, eventually transform our understanding of the wider world? Yet the story of the Great Pestilence was never Europe's alone. Its shadow fell across the entire known world, from the bustling ports of Alexandria to the grand cities of the Silk Road, but the aftermath looked strikingly different in each place. The same bacterium that unraveled feudalism in the West did not produce the same social revolution elsewhere. The outcome depended entirely on the ground it found. Consider the Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt and Syria. Here, the population faced similar profound transitions, but the political system bent without breaking. The Mamluks relied on a centralized state and a unique system of military service where trained soldiers held ultimate authority. This structure, while rigid, proved resilient. Even with a reduced population, the state's core mechanism of control remained intact, preventing the kind of widespread bargaining power for laborers that reshaped Europe. The context was everything. Far to the east, China under the Mongol Yuan dynasty also endured deep hardship. The great changes there are seen by many scholars as a contributing factor in the dynasty's eventual decline, helping to fuel popular unrest that led to its overthrow and the rise of the native Ming dynasty. This was a parallel process of dramatic regime change, yet it did not spark the same fundamental revaluation of the individual's worth in economic and social life. So why did Europe transform so uniquely? The answer lies in a specific constellation of pre-existing conditions. Europe's feudalism was a patchwork of countless manners and competing political entities, each with its own lord and localized power. There was no single, centralized authority that could impose a uniform response across the continent. When the old system faltered, there was no emperor to forcibly reset the clock. This fragmentation created openings through which change could flow. At the same time, Europe already possessed a vibrant commercial spirit, with active trade routes and a growing urban merchant class ready to capitalize on the disruption. The plague did not create these forces, but it acted as a sudden, immense catalyst, accelerating their effects exponentially. It was the combination of a rigid but vulnerable social hierarchy, a politically divided landscape, and a latent economic dynamism that made Europe's encounter with this pandemic a genuine turning point. The same storm sank some ships and merely battered others, but in Europe it washed away the old shorelines, leaving entirely new land to build upon. We often imagine the plague years as a time of pure chaos and confusion, but the truth is far more complex. A stubborn myth suggests that medieval people had no concept of illness passing between people, blindly stumbling into sickness. In reality, many towns and cities acted with remarkable foresight. When a ship approached a harbor, officials might require it to wait offshore for 40 days, a practice called quarantine, from the Italian word for 40. Inside affected cities, healthy families would often bar their doors, keeping those who were unwell separated within their own homes. Some communities established special places for care or isolation houses outside their walls and put in place measures to limit travel in and out of affected regions. They did not understand the specific cause, but they correctly observed that the sickness could move from one person to another, and they took thoughtful, practical steps based on that evidence. Another common misunderstanding is that the Black Death was a single, sudden event that simply stopped. The Great Wave of illness in the 1340s was only the first and most severe outbreak. The sickness returned many times, with significant periods of illness touching every generation for centuries. It became a recurring presence in the story of Europe, a lingering reality that communities learned to live alongside. Each new period of challenge reinforced the social and economic changes that had begun with the first. Shifts in the availability of workers would again influence wages, and each experience with widespread illness deepened the cultural attention on individual life and its meaning. This was not a one-time shock from which society simply bounced back, but a lasting change to the rhythm of daily life. The belief that medical knowledge stood completely still is also a misconception. While their methods were often not successful and based on incomplete theories, this period saw the growth of university-educated physicians. Cities began to employ these trained doctors to offer community health guidance and create rules for public well-being. They designed detailed protective outfits, including long robes and beak-like masks filled with fragrant herbs, in a sincere attempt to guard against what they believed was harmful air. This was the slow, early stage of a more organized approach to medicine, one that valued careful watching and civic duty. By looking past these simplifications, we see a much richer picture. The people of the 14th and 15th centuries were not just passive recipients of an unseen force. They were thinking, adapting human beings who observed their world, made difficult choices, and took concrete actions to safeguard their communities. They faced an invisible challenge using the best tools and knowledge they had, and in doing so, they began to lay the groundwork for the modern ideas of public health, community responsibility, and learning from experience. Their story is not one of ignorance, but of a deep and difficult search for understanding in the face of an overwhelming situation. The world that emerged from the shadow of sickness carried a profoundly different spirit. A quiet but resilient individualism had taken root in the European mind, born from the stark realization that traditional authorities could not offer protection. This was not a cold selfishness, but a new understanding that one's own fate and salvation were, in part, personal responsibilities. The old acceptance of a fixed place in a divine hierarchy gave way to a more pragmatic and questioning attitude. If a laborer could negotiate the price of his work and a merchant could build a fortune through his own wits, then surely other forms of authority could be challenged as well. This cultural shift toward self-reliance and initiative became a defining trait. a collective character strengthened by shared experience yet open to new possibilities. This new mindset found its ultimate expression in the economic engine that the great changes had set in motion. The rise of wage labor, market-based economies, and a wealthy merchant class did not merely alter local trade. It created the very system of capitalism that would one day power global expansion. The capital accumulated by banking families and guilds provided the fuel for voyages of discovery, funding the ships that would eventually cross oceans in search of new trade routes. The same profit-driven logic that guided a farmer to enclose his fields for wool would later drive the investment in mills and machinery, laying the financial and intellectual groundwork for the Industrial Revolution centuries later. The pandemic had, against all odds, initiated an economic restructuring whose momentum would carry Europe into the modern age. Politically, the fragmented landscape of feudal loyalties was consolidating into a new and powerful entity, the nation-state. The weakening of the aristocracy had cleared the way for monarchs to centralize power, creating royal courts, standing armies, and bureaucracies that answered to a central crown rather than a local lord. This transition from a patchwork of fiefdoms to unified kingdoms with stronger national identities fundamentally reshaped the continent's political map. The concept of sovereignty, of a state governing a defined territory and people, became the dominant model for the modern world, a direct legacy of the power vacuum the old order left behind. When we trace the lineage of modern Western values, we often find their origins in this pivotal era. The belief in social mobility, the drive for scientific inquiry, and the emphasis on the individual's potential all found fertile ground in the world remade by the great changes. The collective experience of that time forged a tougher, more adaptable society, one less willing to accept the fatalism of the past and more inclined to seek improvement through human effort and reason. In this profound sense, the plague years were not an end, but a difficult and meaningful beginning, a foundational event that set the stage for the world we recognize today. This story of collapse carries an unexpected message of hope. The immense hardship of those years did not lead to permanent ruin, but instead forged a remarkable human resilience. When faced with almost unimaginable change, the survivors did not simply rebuild the world they had known. They looked at the cracked foundations of the old order and chose to construct something new, something far more dynamic and ultimately stronger. The crisis acted as a powerful catalyst, breaking apart rigid structures that had resisted change for centuries. In their place, it allowed for more fluid and responsive systems to emerge, from market-based economies to stronger central states. This profound transformation offers a powerful lesson about the nature of our social orders. It shows us that even from the depths of difficulty, the seeds of a better world can take root. The old feudal system, with its fixed hierarchies and localized power, was like a mighty oak tree, strong and deeply rooted, but unable to bend in a storm. The Great Transition was that storm, and the oak splintered. What grew in its place was not another oak, but a diverse and adaptable forest, a complex ecosystem of competing powers, commercial networks, and individual initiative that could withstand future challenges. This narrative of change and renewal resonates deeply in our own era of global questions. It reminds us that while difficult times are always a human experience, they can also clear the ground for necessary evolution, forcing innovation in technology, economics, and governance that prosperity alone might never inspire. The story of that period is ultimately a testament to our enduring capacity to adapt, to find opportunity in difficulty, and to forge a new path forward when the old one has faded from view. The Black Death was far more than a story of immense transition. It was the crucible that melted down the old feudal Europe and forged a new one. We have journeyed from the crowded manners of the 14th century to the dawn of the Renaissance, witnessing how a profound crisis dismantled one world and painstakingly built another. The rigid chains of serfdom gave way to new freedoms for the common person, as labor became a valued resource to be negotiated, not just an obligation to be commanded. The quiet fields once worked by bonded hands became the birthplace of a market economy, where cash and contract began to replace service and status. And from the weakened power of the old aristocracy rose the foundations of the modern state, with central authority and civic institutions taking root. This period teaches us a powerful and enduring lesson that even in the most challenging of times, humanity possesses an incredible capacity for adaptation and renewal. From the deepest hardship can emerge not only survival, but the seeds of a stronger, more dynamic future. If you found this exploration of one of history's great turning points compelling, we invite you to subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We would also love to hear your thoughts on the legacy of this pivotal era in the comments below.